This meeting is being recorded.
All right, well, good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So my name is Annie Carter, and I am the program coordinator here at Colorado Canyons Association. A lot of you are probably familiar with our work, but we're a nonprofit and we partner with the Bureau of Land Management to do education, outreach, and stewardship on the 3 national conservation areas here in Colorado. We're so lucky to have all 3 of them here in Western Colorado. And so this is our 2022 lecture series, the kickoff of it. We're going to have these lectures the next every 2 weeks, Tuesday nights from 5:30 to 6:30. Genevieve Fuller is here with us tonight. She is a terrestrial biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and she's going to be telling us all about the desert bighorn sheep of Black Ridge. So everything with the study, monitoring, and management of this species. Her work includes other species as well, but the desert bighorn sheep are just so iconic to this landscape here. And I'm sure all of us, myself included, are really excited to learn more about them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Genevieve.
Hi, again, I'm Genevieve Fuller, and I work for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I'm here today to talk about the desert bighorn sheep, specifically the sheep that we call the Black Ridge sheep herd. They live in the McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area and a little bit in the Colorado National Monument. So these guys are very iconic. They're very charismatic. I know that they're pretty special to a lot of people's hearts who spend time out in these national conservation areas. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of the history of this herd, some of the translocations we've done in the past, the biology of desert bighorn sheep, and some of the management, the current status of this herd. All right, so just starting with desert bighorn sheep as a whole, let's kind of get some of this terminology together. So the males, we call those rams. They're the ones with the very large curved horns. Those horns are actually made out of keratin, which is the same as our hair and our fingernails. They don't shed these horns like elk and deer. Elk and deer have what we call antlers. Those actually fall off every year, but the horns on bighorn sheep stay on them and grow a little bit more every year. And so they can actually get really big, and the males will actually bust the tips off the ends, and we call those horns, after the tips have come off, we call them broomed horns. Horn growth actually slows during those hard winter months every year, and it creates a ring on the horn. And we can actually estimate how old a ram is based on how many rings he has on his horns. You can do that a little bit with the females, but the females, which we call ewes, they have a lot smaller horns, and it's harder to see how many rings they have. So we actually use their teeth as well to estimate an age on them. We call the young lambs, and if I'm saying yearling, that just means a 1-year-old individual, and adults we consider to be 2+ years old. So bighorn sheep are the state mammal of Colorado, and we have 2 subspecies here in Colorado, the deserts and the Rocky Mountains. So desert bighorn sheep are actually a subspecies of Ovis canadensis. They are the same species as the Rocky Mountain bighorns that we see in those high mountains. They're just a little bit smaller and more well adapted for those desert climates. So only a small amount of the desert bighorn sheep in the US are in Colorado. A lot of the desert bighorns are going to be in Nevada and California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and a little bit in Texas. So only a small portion actually live in Colorado. So just a couple of quick differences between desert bighorns and Rocky Mountain bighorns. Desert bighorns are generally smaller and they occupy dry climates. Rocky Mountain bighorns can actually be seen in dry climates too, but the deserts too seem to be slightly better suited to those dry climates, where the Rockies tend to be better suited to those higher, colder climates. The two subspecies actually can and do interbreed where their habitats overlap. So a couple quick sheep facts. So the rams will live between 9 and 12 years old, and the ewes will live with between 10 and 14. They can weigh up to 160 to 250 pounds, sometimes exceeding 350 pounds. The ram horns alone can weigh over 30 pounds, so they're carrying a lot on their head with those. They're definitely pretty heavy. The desert bighorns do weigh slightly less. The primary predators for bighorn sheep are mountain lions, but the lambs can be predated upon by the mountain lions, coyotes, golden eagles, and bears. Sheep are reliant on what we call escape terrain for protection from predators. So that's going to be those big cliffs, those places that they can get up on. They are amazing climbers. They can stick to rock walls that look like nobody should be able to stand on them. That's kind of their strategy for avoiding predation is to get up into that escape terrain, those areas where they are in their element and other critters are kind of struggling for footing. So specifically with these desert bighorns, we get to see an interesting life cycle. In the spring, pretty much from right now all the way into May, they're going to be lambing. So there's actually already lambs out on the ground in McInnis Canyon. I've been getting several reports of lambs already being out there. And then they'll give birth well into May. So most of them are done by that end of May, but they have this big range where they'll give birth to their lambs. And usually around this time, the rams are living in these bachelor groups. In the summer, there's lots of forage available. They're growing a lot. They're raising their young. Water can be hard to find, especially at the end of the summer. We'll talk a little bit more about how important water is to desert bighorns a little bit later. So in the fall, rams will start to intermingle with the ewes and lambs, and they'll actually start breeding in November, which is also when we have hunting seasons. Winter can be a challenging time for sheep. There's less forage and maybe surviving on fast stores, depending on what the forage conditions are like and if there's snow or not on the ground, that may make them a little have to work a little bit harder to get at those food sources. So overall, the history of desert bighorns in Colorado, we actually have no concrete evidence that desert bighorn sheep in particular occupy the McInnis Canyons or any other desert locations across Colorado. Pictographs in the area certainly suggest that a bighorn sheep species or a relative of some kind has occupied canyons in the distant past and were pretty important to the local people. I've seen a number of pictographs all across the canyons, all over Colorado and into Utah that depict bighorn sheep. What species that was is hard to say, especially from those older pictographs. So any sheep that did originate in Colorado were extirpated in the early 1800s before we really had written records of them. So we did identify that the habitat in these areas were good for sheep and that some sort of bighorn sheep probably did live in the area. And so Colorado Parks and Wildlife first translocated some desert bighorn sheep in 1979 from Copa, Arizona. Between 1979 and 2001, CPW, which was then called the Colorado Division of Wildlife, conducted 12 transplant operations and translocated 218 desert bighorn sheep from Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. In 2010 and 2011, we also transplanted 30 bighorn sheep from the upper Dolores River and to the middle Dolores as a range expansion / supplemental transplant. So you can see that these significant and extensive transplant efforts has granted Colorado 3 desert bighorn sheep herds in what we call 4 game management units. So we manage these populations as 4 separate areas, but three herds. So you can see in that map, those sections that are highlighted orange are where we have desert bighorns in Colorado, and all those other polygons there, those shapes are Rocky Mountain bighorns. So statewide, our desert bighorn sheep population estimates have been climbing since the 1980s. The rams are actually in blue on this graph, and the ewes are in red. And as you can see, they kind of took a little bit of a dive there in the early 2000s, but have since recovered and continue to increase. In 2020, we had an estimate at 550 desert bighorn sheep. Just most recently. So out of the 3 bighorn herds in Colorado, the one that we're going to talk about today is the Black Ridge herd, or S56. That's just kind of the game management unit. That's what we call them when we're talking about different sheep herds. It keeps it shorter than saying Black Ridge sheep herd every single time. So we shorten it to S56. These sheep mostly live on the Colorado National Monument and on BLM land, specifically the McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area. So we named them after the Black Ridge Wilderness Area, which is really important for the protection of these sheep. And we also have desert bighorns that occupy the Dominguez Escalante National Conservation Area as well, but we're going to largely focus on the Black Ridge sheep today. So these orange blobs out here are actually based on both GPS collar data and visual observations from both ground and with helicopters and fixed wings. We essentially, I've kind of created a general range so that we can, so you can see kind of where they're most centrally located. I suspect that they are definitely outside of these areas, but you know, our data is limited to a certain extent. There's a lot of places for sheep to go where they aren't detected. And then also a lot of this is based off of GPS collars, and we try to spread out GPS collars as much as possible, but we definitely miss some areas that certainly do have desert bighorn sheep. So this is more to give you a good idea of where we have seen them most recently. So specifically in Black Ridge, we had 36 total sheep translocated to establish population here. So again, it started in 1979. We released 11 total sheep into Devil's Canyon. In 1980, we released 16 more into Monument Canyon. And 1981, we put 9 more in Devil's Canyon. In 1995, we put 22 in Knowles Canyon. So we kind of ended up spreading them out a little bit. So Paul Creedon, recently retired Colorado Parks Wildlife District wildlife manager, did some work on the desert bighorns in the 1980s and 90s, and the herd seemed to be doing well after the translocations. There was an estimate of 40 sheep in October in 1983, and then the herd increased to approximately 100 to 125 sheep in the early 1990s. However, lamb production was slow through this period, and we did detect a decline in the 1990s, probably down to less than 50 animals. There was some evidence of disease, but it's kind of difficult to get your hands on enough to actually get disease testing done at that time. So the reason for the decline is not really well known, but that is a hypothesis as to why we saw the decline. But in 2003, we started doing some helicopter surveys and recorded a lamb-ewe ratio of 66.7. So lamb-ewe ratios we're basically looking at how many lambs per 100 ewes are out there. And if there's a lot of lambs, where a good portion of the ewes have a lamb with them. That's showing a population growth over time. And so that's one of our metrics for gauging what the population is doing. So we started to see those lamb ewe ratios increase, and then we did what we call a mark-free site study in 2010. It included capturing and collaring some ewes and putting ear tags in them. And that actually allows us to figure out the ratio of marked animals, the ones that we know are out there that we are seeing, to the unmarked animals. So we can actually estimate a pretty good population estimate. So at that time, we got about 200 sheep, which seems to have been stayed around that level up until now. But we're certainly looking to continue to expand our understanding of how many animals are out there. I'll talk a little bit more about how difficult it is to actually estimate how many sheep are out there in a few slides. So we've got our population estimate about 200 sheep. Our lamb ewe ratios that we've collected are suggesting the population is staying fairly stable. So we're still going to be seeking some more intensive monitoring in upcoming years. I'm hoping to get some helicopter surveys done, and we are doing a number of ground surveys. So those we actually do look for volunteers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So like everything else out on the landscape, we've got some important issues that affect desert bighorns in this area. Certainly some concerns are about disease. There's predation by mountain lions and other critters, and competition with other wildlife on the landscape. There's also habitat quality and quantity, how much is protected for them and what that habitat looks like. And then recreational disturbance. So just looking at disease, a lot of diseases we have seen transmission from domestic sheep and goats, specifically a number of types of pneumonias. These have been detected in the Black Ridge sheep, and we certainly look out for them. Sometimes you'll see these sheep coughing, or they'll have mucus coming out of their nose. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in dire straits just yet, but it does mean that they might be sick and they might be struggling. So if there's other issues on the landscape, or if it's getting into the lambs, it might reduce our lamb ewe ratios and not be getting as many of those lambs into the next year. There's also we've seen some lungworm and sinus tumors and hemorrhagic diseases in other Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. And so we certainly look out for that. And we do get a lot of questions about bighorn sheep and chronic wasting disease, which is a prion disease that exists in cervids, so elk and deer. And so we have done a study, and in both our captive and free-ranging bighorn sheep that we took samples of, we've determined no clinical signs, pathologies that suggest chronic wasting disease is transmissible to bighorn sheep. So hopefully that one's not another one on our plate, but disease can really affect bighorn sheep populations. And so we're always monitoring as much as possible. Whenever I can, I'll get disease testing done so that we can manage that as best as possible. So then there's predation, competition. So mountain lions are definitely a factor when it comes to bighorn sheep populations. There's not much else that is savvy enough to hunt these critters. They're pretty resilient and pretty hard to catch. So mountain lions are the main predator there. But we also will see habitat competition between bighorn sheep and elk and deer. If you've been out hiking in the McInnis canyons, you'll notice there's actually quite a few elk and deer out there. competing for similar or the same resources as these bighorn sheep. And then there's habitat quality. So, there's the amount of quality habitat out there that really can limit these sheep. We're lucky to have some really great conservation areas and wilderness areas that kind of limit some of the development that happens out there. So the quantity of habitat is quite good out there. But with, we've had a pretty steady drought for the last several years. And so that does affect some of the plant life out there and affect the habitat quality. Water accessibility is huge with desert bighorns and bighorn sheep all around. They need water sources, and in drought periods and dry months, you can see some of those smaller streams dry up, and then they have to make sure they get down and find water sources. For the McInnis Canyon sheep, where we see them head down to the Colorado River quite often. So if you end up floating the river, you can often see them coming down for a drink if you're lucky. But they really require water, so they might not be able to exist in certain places just because of limited water availability. Recreation and development. So hiking, getting out on bikes, or there's definitely not a lot of biking available in the area. That's the nice thing about wilderness, is it's mostly hiking, and they do come down to the river for a drink, and people are out fishing, and people are out rafting, and so we definitely see some impacts of recreation, especially when those lambs are really young, like right now. It's pretty sensitive period of time for them, and so they're a lot more sensitive to disturbance than they are at other times of the year. But it's still not well known. So we are actually in the middle of a recreation study. This is actually taking place on the Dominguez Escalante National Conservation Area. So a different sheep herd. There's a little bit overlap between these two herds, but this study is focused on the Dominguez Escalante. And so it's to monitor and estimate impact of recreation on habitat use and behavior of desert bighorn sheep, specifically with where the ewes choose to lamb and raise their young when they're very, very small. They're very specific about where they like to raise their young. Those places that are really good escape habitat to protect them from predation, but also give them the availability of water. And so those areas can be specifically more sensitive, especially right now when they're lambing. So the fieldwork did start in December 2020, and it will continue until December 2022. We've captured and collared 20 ewes out there. So if you are out in those canyons and you see some collared ewes with ear tags in, that is for that study. We also have 80 remote cameras set up, and so we'll be looking into what those effects might be, but that study is not yet complete. All right, so we've got a number of management and study tools that we use to monitor and manage these sheep out on the landscape. So we've got hunting licenses and the hunting mandatory checks. Those aren't as important with desert bighorn sheep as they are with maybe some of our other big game populations. We've got regulations and seasonal closures. We might impose a seasonal closure on an area that's a specifically very sensitive to the sheep at a certain time of year. We use sighting reports. So if anybody calls me and says they saw a certain number of bighorn sheep, send me photos, send me videos, I'll use that. We do health and disease monitoring. Every time a sheep dies and I can get my hands on it, I will actually do disease testing. Also, we try and do that whenever we handle these guys. We want to get as much data as we can if we're going to put hands on them. And then habitat improvements. We're always working with our land agencies, BLM and Monument, to work with them on habitat projects. That also goes for water management. We can put wildlife guzzlers out there. They actually collect rainwater and in these containers that prevent a lot of evaporation and allow for water access even when it's dry. We'll put out GPS collars, figure out where they're going, what habitat they're using. And then we use our translocation and restoration to expand some of these populations, especially if one population of sheep is doing really well, we might attempt to help them expand their range. And then how we're generally keeping track of these guys is through our population classification surveys. So there are some pretty major challenges to studying wild animals. They are very difficult to count, especially you can imagine all those canyons and geologic features that make it very difficult to even see the animals. And they actually blend in very well with their environment, and so it makes them very difficult to count. Especially because a lot of these populations are spread across pretty large areas. And so it can be really challenging to get a good estimate. And so a lot of times we get a sample size and then we use it to make assumptions about the larger population. There's also a lot of variables that are hard to control for, as we were talking about all those issues, and then, you know, all these different things that can affect the habitat, that can affect whether a lamb survives to the end of the year. So we do our very best, and we've got a lot of really great tools, but we'll never know exactly the perfect number of how many animals are on the landscape. We just get as good of an estimate as we can. So we do have a hunt in S56. We do give out 4 ram licenses a year. It's 1.5% of the population, and they must be a half pearl ram or larger. There are no ewes hunted in this unit. And all hunted rams must be checked through mandatory check stations, which means we get data off of them. And we are seeing a slightly increasing age trend, which is promising. So this data is actually fairly useful. We'll also do disease sampling as well. And so this is a great resource for us. We do have GPS collars. It gives us great location data. It maps movement. We can figure out what habitat the sheep are using. We can do what's called a mark restart site analysis, which is what we were talking about, how we got to our 200 sheep population estimate. And then we also get mortality data. What is the main factor for why sheep die out here? That can be really useful, especially if we can get ahead of, you know, some issues that are starting to crop up. In McInnis canyons right now, we only have dead collars deployed currently. I'd love to get some more out there at some point, but right now, if you see a sheep with a collar, you can assume that collar is that sheep is getting up there in years. They no longer function, but I do keep track of them, especially because they do have ear collars, and so I can, or ear tags. So they're different colors and have different numbers on them, and I can actually report which sheep that is and where they're at, and continue to collect data on them. So our population and classification surveys, these are 3 main types that we use in Colorado for bighorn sheep. As I was talking about the Mark Re-site, those are really costly and time intensive and high disturbance. It involves going in and we have to capture sheep. We have to put collars on them and make sure we have a certain number of them marked in the area so that we can compare that to how many we're seeing unmarked. And so while it is costly and time intensive and high disturbance, it gives us a pretty good statistical population estimate. But we can't do that every year. There's too much work and money involved. So we do aerial counts whenever we can. Those can be costly as well. We'll do them as frequently as we can. They are a little bit more disturbing than say ground counts, because we've got a big, large helicopter usually flying pretty close to them. It might they might run from it to a certain degree. Sometimes they'll just sit there and take a nap under a bush and just kind of look up at us, which actually makes them really hard to see. And so we still get pretty decent classification data, which means we're getting a good idea of how many lambs to use and how many rams to use are out there. But it's not always the best for a population estimate. We can use it to get a better idea of population trend instead. And then we also do coordinated ground counts. And those are great. They're usually cheap. They're a half day. They're easy to conduct. We can use a lot of different people. We can get, it's pretty easy to train people on. And, but it's not a very good survey for population estimation. It's really more about getting those ratios of lamb to ewe and ram to ewe and get an idea of trends over the long term. There are some inherent errors with it. Detection, I mean, you can be standing at the bottom of a canyon and not see some sheep that are just right over the rim. And so then there's also observer error. It kind of takes a little bit of time for you to attune your eye to what a sheep looks like on a landscape that it's evolved to blend in with. And so there is a certain amount of observer error involved there as well. But it does provide pretty decent classification data, getting up those ratios. And so we're trying to conduct those every year if we can. So yeah, just talk a little bit more about our ground surveys. We're trying to do them annually, late April, early May. We do them across the Colorado National Monument and the McInnis Canyons NCA. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, National Park Service, and Bureau of Land Management all participate, and then we have a number of volunteers. And so it involves being in a vehicle or an OHV or on foot or on horseback out in the canyons looking for sheep, running certain routes, and trying to spot as many sheep collectively as possible. And so we're classifying those sheep based on how what their sex is and how old they are, as much as we can from a distance. You can't count the rings in a ram's horn. Usually you don't get that close. So a lot of the times we're actually classifying by how far around that horn is, that curve. Saying like half curve, we essentially draw a line between the base of the ear and the eye. And essentially you can see on that photo there that we classify them into half curl, 5/8 curl, 3/4 curl, 7/8 curl, and a full curl. And so those full curls are going to be much older age class sheep. Those are going to be your big old lambs, whereas those half curls are going to be 2 or 3 years old. And so that's the data we're mostly collecting is how many sheep are we seeing, how many lambs, how many ewes, how many yearling rams, how many full curls, how many 5/8 curls that were out there. And so even if you're not out on one of my surveys, it is really fun to go looking for sheep. They are super fun to watch. They are very charismatic and very interesting. So if you do want to go out into McInnis Canyons or the monument to go look for sheep, here are just a couple of quick tips. So starting early is always a good idea. That's generally a good idea if you want to watch any wildlife. Wildlife tend to move around early in the morning. And so you're more likely to see animals that are moving versus ones that are taking naps. So if you start early and if you're in a good spotting spot when the light is getting good around 6:30 a.m., 7 a.m., around this time, maybe even a little later, you can get out into areas where you can have a chance of spotting these guys. Not everybody wants to wake up that early. You can still see sheep if you sleep in a little bit, but this helps give you the best opportunity. It's not about covering miles. It's about examining the most potential sheep habitat. So some people go on hikes specifically to go take a look at sheep. But if you're hiking real fast, you might miss them. It's good to like hike a little bit, take out your binoculars, look at some of the sheep habitat, and then keep going. When you take out your binoculars or your spotting scope or whatever you brought to look at something or to look through it, we call it glassing. That's just kind of the phrase we like to use. So we encourage you to glass the same areas from different angles as you hike. Sometimes they'll be behind different bits of rocks or brush, and you might not see them from one angle, but then you move up trail a little bit and you turn around and there they are. Listen for the sheep moving rocks and bleeding. They're sometimes not the quietest animals. They get a little confident being up on those cliffs, thinking that nobody can get up to them, and so they'll sometimes shift rocks. I've actually had them shift rocks down on top of me before, and so if you're listening for it, you might even be able to hear them before you see them. So my tips are hike for a bit, sit and glass through those binoculars, and look for those white butts and movement. The rest of their bodies kind of blend in with the background pretty well, so their hind ends are the flashiest part of them. And then just repeat. So where you can find sheep, specifically what terrain to be looking in. They use the ridge lines. They're rarely in the bottoms, but you will see them in the bottoms sometimes. But usually they're on the sides of the canyon, especially those areas where they can do a lot of grazing, maybe take a nap, but give them some escape terrain to run to pretty close by if they need to. They like to be close to the steep rock walls. They like areas where they can see a lot of land, especially in those times when they're taking naps. They really like to be able to see out and see if anything's approaching. Shady areas in the heat of day, especially in the summertime, or as we're getting into those warmer months, they'll start hanging out in the shade in the middle of the day because it'll be getting a bit hot. They can be very hard to see, and they are easily overlooked. Sometimes you think that you can just go out there and you'll just see them, and sometimes they're standing on the side of the road. I'm sure a number of you have driven through the monument and seen the sheep right next to it. But sometimes they're a little further away and you have to look a little bit harder. So bringing binoculars and spotting scopes is always a good thing, especially because it's a really nice thing to keep your distance from these guys. So places to look, the places where I've personally seen sheep and know there's been a lot of good sheep sightings. It's going to be Fruita Canyon, Monument Canyon, Codell's, Devils, Rattlesnake, Me, Knowles, and Jones. But especially those ones like Codell's and Devils, I see a lot of sheep very frequently. If you want to go out and look for them, you're very likely to see them out there. And there's a bunch of great hiking trails in those areas too that you can kind of cruise through and still see sheep. Just a reminder, respect the sheep, keep your distance and observe from afar. I know there's some sheep that have become a little habituated, especially in the national park there. Just because they're habituated to cars and bicycles doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to disturb them if you get out and start walking towards them. Especially since they're near traffic, there's potential for scaring them right into the path of the car. So just be careful, keep your distance, observe from afar. Be careful about bringing your dog. Definitely keep your distance if you have a dog with you, and make sure your dog has off-leash control or is on a leash. And then give them a little extra space in the spring when they have young lambs. They're going to be more sensitive that time of year to disturbance. And if they have to move around a lot more, they're going to be spending a lot of their energy. And those poor ewes are trying to feed their young as well as feed themselves. So just a reminder to kind of keep your distance from them. And then, yeah, can you spot those sheep that are sitting on that ledge there? They can be really hard to spot, but if you're really diligent about it and you start to figure it out, you can start to see them in places like this. So these sheep are actually sitting on this bench down here. They're down here on this ledge area taking a nap in the shade. So those are your sheep. Sometimes you can spot them from a good long ways away, and they are tricky to see. So, and then sometimes you can see them up close and get some really great shots. Again, respect them as much as possible, but they're very cool critters, and they're very cool to see moving across the landscape. They're so sure-footed. It's kind of crazy some of the things that they're able to get through. So management of sheep into the future is collaborative experts between Colorado Parks and Wildlife, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, nonprofits, and the broader community. We do have volunteer opportunities and hoping to do some habitat projects and ground surveys coming up here in the future. Thank you very much for having me. I've got my contact information there if people are not able to get their questions through tonight or would like to touch base with me in the future, but happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you talk about the camouflage just in that big aerial image, but the picture where somebody was holding one of the sheep like by the horn, I actually, it took me a while to realize that wasn't a rock. It from the back really looked like a rock. So really a testament to their ability. Yeah, everyone, we have time for questions. So send those out in the chat. I'm going to go through and just read a couple of the ones we've gotten already. So Kate Daniel wanted to know, are there other populations around the world, or are bighorn sheep concentrated in North America?
That's a great question. They are a North American species. They have some relatives in other parts of the world, but desert bighorns are native to North America.
Great. And then we have a couple questions actually about what we can do when we're just out on a hike. So how can we help? Do you want to get reports from people if they see sheep out on a hike?
I love getting reports from people. I've got my email there up on the screen. You're welcome to send me those. I will put them into my database and use them to help me monitor those populations. I also just like hearing about what people are seeing and what behaviors that they're witnessing. I just enjoy hearing about sheep. So yeah, that's always helpful, but mostly just, making sure you're respecting those sheep space and enjoying being out there and seeing those special critters.
Yeah. Then what about getting involved in one of those coordinated ground counts?
Okay, so we do call for volunteers. I actually have a list of volunteers that I email. So if you are interested, you can email me and I'll add you to that list, that email list that I send out. It'll kind of give the dates of the survey and the date and time of the training I put on. So if you are interested in helping out with some of those ground surveys, go ahead and shoot me an email.
Awesome. Laura Johnston wanted to know, what are the main plants in their diet?
So they'll generally eat a lot of grasses. They are actually pretty broad in their diet. They will eat some brush as well, but mostly grasses. There are a bunch of invasive grasses out there that they will not eat, but they are herbivorous and mostly eat grasses and forbs that are out there. But they're pretty broad in their diet, so I won't go into all the different plants that they eat.
For more information about plants, our next lecture in 2 weeks is about rare and endemic plants of the NCAs. Another question, Jan wanted to know, Do you use data from iNaturalist for reporting sightings?
I haven't used much of it. I've looked into some of the data that's shown up on there. Sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's not. We have kind of more specific data that we're looking for, but I definitely do check it on occasion to see. I haven't seen all that many for the sheep that I manage, so I haven't spent much time on it.
Yeah, I think it can be hard with iNaturalist when you're trying to get that picture to make your report. I know I've struggled with that in the past. Feel free to send in more questions, everybody, either in the Q&A or in the chat. We still have some time. I was actually wondering just about the radio collars, how those work. And, I think it's a pretty common thing we see nowadays and have that understanding of it. It must not have too much of an effect on the animal. But do you see an effect on the animals that are collared? And if so, what's that like?
Yeah, we don't see much of an effect on the animal's behavior or anything like that. We are very specific. We won't put a collar out on if the collar, we have to have a certain weight ratio. We won't put too much weight on an animal that can't use that. And we actually have some captive sheep that we test these things out on. So that we can make sure that we aren't doing damage. We can show, we can see how things are working on the sheep when we can control it and when we can take those collars off before we put them on the wild ones. But yeah, those collars, they basically work. They usually have a VHF component and a GPS component. So VHF, very high frequency, that's actually a radio. So it gives off these little pings repetitively. And so we can actually use some of our antennas and equipment to hear those pings and locate those animals on the ground in real time. They'll also give like a slightly faster rate of pings if the animal hasn't moved for 8 hours or so, so that we know that maybe it might be dead, and so we need to go check it out and see what's going on, why that collar isn't moving around. The GPS component connects to a satellite, gets a GPS location, then sends that through the satellite to a server that we can access, and we can get those GPS points. And so depending on what study and how we're using those collars, we'll set different frequencies for how many points a day we're going to get. If we want to do every hour, it's going to drain the battery a lot quicker than if we're going to do 2 points in a day. So just depending on what we're using that data for, we might try and get the GPS frequencies or the GPS point frequencies higher and get more points per day, but at the cost of the battery. And so when the battery dies, it's kind of done.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Maureen had a question. For the 21 sheep that were relocated this week from Colorado Springs to the Beaver Creek Canyon area, how long does it take them to recover from that type of stress? Do they just carry on as usual in their new home?
Pretty much immediately. They head straight out on the landscape. I'm sure it takes them a little bit of time to figure out where they want to be and where the good habitat is because they're not familiar with the landscape. But they're pretty much out there behaving like normal sheep almost immediately after release.
That's impressive. Arlene wanted to know, are there domestic sheep allotments in these areas?
We don't have any that I know of. That's kind of the nice thing about these guys is they're pretty protected where they're at. There are cattle out there, but as far as I know, no sheep. Disease can be transmitted from sheep and goats. So I imagine if a sheep wandered into somebody's, 4-H sheep pen in one of the small residences along the edges there, then we might run into a problem. But for the most part, these guys aren't having much interaction with domestics. whereas some of our Rocky Mountain Bighorn sheep do have sheep allotments in their areas, and we do work with the wool growers to help reduce conflicts and make sure, reduce chances for disease transmission.
Mhm. All right, we have a few more minutes. If anybody else has any remaining questions, we can probably do one or two more. Genevieve, do you know, I thought I had heard that in a survey, maybe last summer, they found sheep in Gunnison Gorge National Conservation Area. Do you know if those would have been desert bighorns or just Rocky Mountain bighorns?
Those would have been Rocky Mountains. There's
Mhm.
some adjacent herds that we monitored over there. Those would be Rocky Mountains.
Gotcha. Well, we'll give it another minute for people to send in questions. I'm also going to just drop in the chat the link to our event page on our website. We've got a whole lot of events coming up this spring. More lectures, like I mentioned, as well as some volunteer opportunities and community events. So we've got a lot of exciting stuff going on this spring. But Genevieve, thank you so much for informing us all about this. Looks like we don't have any more questions. We're just getting some thank yous. Great info, so interesting. I think a lot of us are probably interested in these volunteer opportunities to help out with some really exciting science.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I always like talking to folks about sheep. So if anybody else has any more questions that they think of later, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and this lecture is being recorded, as you all probably heard at the beginning, and this will be getting up onto our YouTube channel, CCA's YouTube channel. So if you have a friend who would love to hear about sheep, you can send that their way. But yeah, thank you so much, Genevieve. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.